Let's talk now about epidemiology, or basically the study of the spread of disease. So an epidemiologist is a branch of microbiology, but they are really looking at how does a disease spread? What's transferring the disease from one person to another? Can we predict the frequency and the distribution of a disease in a certain area? Can we predict the amount of people that will be affected by the disease? There's a lot to think about in epidemiology, and there's also a lot of terms that we're going to go through on this. So firstly, a reservoir is the primary habitat of the pathogen, and every single pathogen has its own primary habitat. Could be a human, an animal, or an insect carrier. It could be water or soil or even a plant. Basically, when I think about the reservoir, I think about where does the pathogen replicate? Where is it normally residing? Where is it replicating the most? The other term is a source. A source is where the individual actually obtained the pathogen. Where did they get this disease from? Many times the reservoir is the same thing as a source. So for example, with the flu, many times the reservoir is a human. The flu virus is replicating in the human. And also this infected human can spread it to another human because it spreads person to person. So in this case, the human is both the reservoir and the source. But sometimes the source could be something that we call a fomite. And you'll see this term a lot. A fomite is an inanimate object, a non-living object that harbors the pathogen for usually a short period of time. So for example, the fomite could be a doorknob, or it could be a food. Like at a buffet, people are touching the same foods and the same plates and the same surfaces. So any type of surface that the person could pick up the disease from, that could be the source. Many times with human diseases, humans are also the reservoir. They're actually the carrier. So a carrier is any person that's spreading a disease to other people. A lot of times, the carrier that has the pathogen doesn't even know that they're carrying the pathogen. You might have been hearing this before with the current COVID-19 pandemic. You might have heard of asymptomatic carrier, which is an individual that's not showing any signs or symptoms. They don't even know they're sick, and they're able to transfer the disease to others. This is one of the most dangerous types of carriers because these people are living their normal daily routine and they don't even know that they can transmit this disease. In the healthcare field, you guys will have to worry about becoming what's called a passive carrier. This is particularly abundant in nursing home or hospitals. So how this works is, for example, this nurse is in one patient's room, and I think this is a bedpan, so she's touching the bedpan without gloves, and then she didn't wash her hands. The pathogen is now on her hands, and now she goes into another patient's room and touches them. So she herself has not been infected, but she's now transmitting the pathogen from one patient to another. This can happen not only with hands, but with clothing or even shoes. Like you could be carrying a pathogen from one room to another. So that's really one of the important reasons we use those protective equipment or put on protective gear when you're going to work with severely immunocompromised individuals. A carrier could be an incubation carrier, meaning the person has recently become infected with the disease. They don't have any signs or symptoms yet, but they're still able to spread the infection from one person to another. This is another example of one of the ways that COVID-19 spreads so quickly is that it has a long incubation period of like 6 to 14 days where somebody could have this disease, not know it, and be spreading it. Similarly, someone could be a convalescent carrier, meaning they're recuperating from the disease. They're feeling better, so they think, oh, hey, I'm ready to go out and live a normal life, but they can still actually be spreading the virus or bacteria. And then finally, we could have a chronic carrier. This would be someone who maybe has this disease for life or a very long period of time, and they're constantly shedding this pathogen. Classic examples we've talked about before are like hepatitis B or C. Oh, also Salmonella typhi. which causes typhoid fever. If you go onto Blackboard, there's a documentary on there called Typhoid Mary. That was a infamous woman who was a cook for these really rich, wealthy families, and she didn't know that she was a carrier of salmonella because she was healthy, she felt fine, but she was actually like touching all these people's food and giving them salmonella typhi, and these people were dying of typhoid fever. I think it's about 45 minutes long. So, obviously, one way that humans can get disease is from other humans. Now, another form of transmission is through an arthropod or an insect vector. So a vector is typically, we say, an insect or arthropod. It could be an animal also that carries the disease from the animal or insect to human. What's interesting about these diseases that are spread by vectors, for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, they only can spread via the vector. They can't necessarily spread human to human, and I'll show you some examples. So there's two classes of vector. We could have a biological vector or a mechanical vector. Here's how I always think about a mechanical vector first. I think about when you're outside on a picnic on a nice day and you're having a cheeseburger. A fly lands somewhere over here on some dog poop. It can pick up some pathogen in the feces, and it can then transmit it, land on your cheeseburger, and then now the pathogen's there, and then you eat it. So that's what a mechanical vector is. The fly is just a passive carrier. It's passive. It's taking the pathogen from one place to another. Now, a biological vector, this means that the vector itself, the insect, is needed for the pathogen's life cycle. A classic example is there's a type of protozoa. It's not a bacteria, it's a protozoa. It's called Plasmodium. Plasmodium require part of its life in a mosquito, part of its life in a human liver, and part of its life in a human red blood cell. And then it goes back to the mosquito. So it requires all three places in its life cycle. It needs the mosquito for its reproduction. And by the way, this disease is known more commonly as malaria. So Plasmodium that cause malaria, they require this mosquito, which is a biological vector. Now, just like there could be insect vectors, there also are diseases called zoonotic diseases or zoonosis, okay? This is a disease that spreads from animal to human. Very classic example, rabies. Okay, rabies, this is a virus that can infect just about any mammal. And then if one mammal is infected with it, for example, a bat, it can then bite the human and it spreads from animal to human. Now, these two terms you've probably seen before. A communicable disease, obviously one that can spread person to person. It's contagious among people. Most pathogenic diseases that we think about are communicable. So, for example, the flu, the coronavirus, strep throat, things like that. Non-communicable diseases cannot spread from human to human. So they're not what we would call contagious. So, for example, obviously things like cancer, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, can't spread those person to person. In microbiology, there are also some non-communicable diseases. So, for example, Lyme disease has to spread from a tick to a human. Lyme disease cannot spread human to human. So, technically, it's non-communicable. It doesn't spread from one human to another. Now, in addition to having animal and insect vectors, we've talked about humans often serve as the main reservoir and source of the disease. Humans can spread disease via direct contact. So this can include things like sexual transmission, which is one very common way diseases spread person to person. But remember, every disease is transmitted very specifically. So a disease that's spread sexually usually doesn't get spread via respiratory route. Also, for example, handshaking. If somebody has a virus or bacteria on their hand and the second person doesn't wash their hands and then they ingest something, they can spread it that way. Or a respiratory route like fine aerosol droplets, like when someone sneezes or coughs. Now, indirect contact, this would suggest perhaps a fomite like a doorknob or a toilet seat, or usually fabric-y materials. Like individuals should never share clothing or undergarments with one another. That would be more common in like children, because that's another way disease can spread. Or especially young children, this is more common if they have like toys that they're putting in their mouth and then another child touches it that way. Of course, food or contaminated water, especially water that hasn't been, like sewage water that hasn't been treated properly, and then somebody drinks it. Now here's some terminology in terms of epidemiology. These terms are pretty straightforward. I'll just kind of tell you some examples. The prevalence is the total number of existing cases in a population, usually represented by a percentage. So, for example, we might say something like the prevalence of the flu virus. There's 50% of Connecticut residents currently have the flu. So it's existing cases. Incidence is a number, a measure over a certain period of time as compared with the general population. So we might say something like there's 10,000 new flu cases this week over that period of time. Mortality rate is the number of deaths. Morbidity rate is the number of people that are afflicted with the disease current. Actually, if you go onto the Connecticut Department of Public Health website right now, you could see all these statistics for the coronavirus. And you will see these kind of graphs like this. You might have already been checking them, but I've been checking them too. And also you could see incidence rates of the coronavirus for specific age groups. An endemic disease is one that we kind of know it's coming. It's almost like we know it's coming, and often it comes at a certain period of time each year. And it usually affects a very specific geographic location. So, for example, here in Connecticut and New England, what's endemic to us is, of course, Lyme disease. We know it's coming every year. We know it's coming in New England, and we know it's coming during the summertime. Sporadic diseases, sporadic occurrence. It's not predictable. We don't know when it's going to come. It could come pretty much at any time and anywhere. So, for example, this graph is showing typhoid fever, Salmonella typhi. It's random, and you can see there's not like huge outbreaks of cases. They're just randomly spotted throughout the country. An epidemic is like we didn't know it was coming. It was not predictable. The disease was increased greater beyond what we thought. Many years when we don't predict the flu properly, we will see epidemics, clusters of the flu virus. Usually we also may use the term outbreak. A lot of people interchangeably use outbreak and epidemic. Outbreak may be used more for a very small location, like if one city has an outbreak of cholera because the water wasn't treated properly. It's a very narrowed down location, whereas epidemic may be like these clusters throughout an entire country. Pandemic is basically an epidemic, but it's worldwide. Obviously, right now, COVID-19 is a pandemic. HIV virus also considered a pandemic. Lastly, I want to talk about what's called a nosocomial infection. Nosocomial infections, also known as healthcare-associated infections. These are infections that we find in medical facilities, in hospitals, nursing homes. Where these diseases come from, obviously, in the hospital, that's where we're going to find the most drug-resistant bacteria, the highest amount of pathogens, because sick people are there, that's where the pathogens are located. Especially dangerous is when somebody has a surgical procedure. They're now maybe immunocompromised, especially if there was an incision, an opening, and then bacteria, viruses can penetrate the skin. Any type of medical equipment is at risk for harboring these severe pathogens. And even the hospital personnel could be carriers of nosocomial pathogens. This table shows you some of the classic examples. Some of the biggest ones, of course, you're going to see Staph aureus or methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which is a hospital-associated infection. The other one that you will see a lot is Clostridium difficile, which is associated with broad-spectrum antibiotic use. This is a very common hospital-associated infection. You'll also see something called Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Pseudomonas is extremely highly resistant. They even did a recent study. They found this bacteria was living inside of soap dispensers that had soap in it. It was just chilling in there. So these are some key ones that we should take a look at. And later in the semester, when we go through every pathogen, we'll talk about all of these different diseases. But I just wanted to make you aware of them now.